Hoping that's like my dog, which is all bark, no bite. Hello, team, and welcome to Bureaucracy. I'm your host, Emily Gross, and we have a blast from the past today. Very excited to have Joe Dresen with us, who's from the Kennan Institute, who's going to be talking to us all about what's going on in Ukraine and its war against Russia. And it's been a while since we've covered it, and so happy to have you back.
Great to be back.
So before we begin, what are we drinking?
So I'm not a big beer guy, so I got my Keep Calm and Study Russia mug from the Kennan Institute. It's
Love it.
Pockmarked years experience. And I am a Diet Coke addict. If you go on my social media on Twitter, X, search at Dresen JO, you will find me next to the Coca-Cola polar bear at the Coca-Cola headquarters. It's a
good to know.
It was a keeper. I had hair back then too.
All right. I won't even dare mention Pepsi. However,
Pepsi's not okay.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry to even bring it up. So I am drinking a very old Blue Moon that was in the back of my fridge. Very excited. Anyways, cheers. Happy to have you back.
Glad to be back.
Ooh, that tastes really old. We may just be having, that might be extra fermented if we're being honest.
I would send you a Diet Coke if I could.
Yeah, thank you so much. So there's been a lot going on in the past couple of weeks with the war between Russia and Ukraine. What kind of felt like a stagnant summer in a way. Didn't really see that much in the media, has now kind of roared back to life. Would love for you just to kind of give an overview of what's been happening in the past couple of weeks.
Okay. Well, I think you wanted to start with the surprise Kursk Oblast invasion, which was launched on August 6th. And originally it was thought to be 1,000 or 2,000 Ukrainian troops sort of just pouring over the border at poorly defended checkpoints. Now there's an estimated 10,000 troops in the region. So they've reinforced their positions there. And as opposed to like the battle-hardened, relatively well-equipped Russian troops fighting on the front lines in Ukraine, the Kursk, sort of border guards were ill-equipped and totally unprepared for the Ukrainians to come across the border in force. Hundreds have been taken prisoner, and dozens, if not hundreds more, have been killed during this rapid advance. Something like 100 settlements in the area are now under Ukraine's control, including a strategic natural gas hub. And, I guess the question most people have is, well, why do they do it, right? Why do they take troops that should be some would say fighting the Russian troops in Ukraine, the ones that are making slow but steady progress towards sort of strategic points within the region. So one theory is that the offensive into Russia proper would draw troops away from the Russians on offense in Ukraine. Another theory was that it would provide a bargaining chip in any sort of future peace negotiation, land for land swap sort of thing. But I think the most likely reason is the reaction I've read from dozens of Russian citizens in the region who are sort of captured by Russian social media, what have you, referring to the start of the war as 3 weeks ago when the Ukrainians arrived on their doorstep, forcing them to evacuate their homes. In other words, I don't think Putin is going to be pressured to end the war by anybody but Russians. And until his own people force him to end the war or force him out, I think Putin is in it for the long term. I'll throw one more point on this part of the conversation. It's been an emerging conventional wisdom that in the age of drone warfare with thousands of these things in the sky at a time, that's just impossible to have any kind of tactical surprise for mass troop movements, but Ukraine has really proved otherwise with this. They were very careful in how they staged it, how they concealed their intent, and then how they just rapidly exploited the weakness in the Russian lines.
Wow. So this was extremely unexpected. And I think really a lot of Western powers, I think, were kind of shocked at Ukraine's ability to do this. Is that a general consensus you feel as well?
The interviews with policymakers I've seen, American, European, they were all taken by surprise. So Ukrainian operational security extended to their allies. And for reasons good or bad, they're sustaining their presence inside of Russia. I think they've made some additional feints in the Belgorod region, nowhere near in as much force as the Kursk grouping. And I don't think the allies to this day know what the Ukrainians intend to do with their opportunity to be in Kursk. They did seize a natural gas hub. That was important. They are close to a nuclear power station. By close, I mean, dozens of kilometers, but a lot closer than they were, 3 weeks ago. That's for sure. And so a lot of people are really worried, but one person who doesn't seem all that concerned, at least not on TV, is President Putin. He is in no hurry to expel the Ukrainian invaders from Russian lands. He hasn't called it, an invasion per se. He calls it a terrorist act. And he's not mounting any sort of special mobilization, which means, a forced draft of military-aged fighting men to sort of repel the hordes of Ukrainians. I think he's concerned what that would do. There's sort of a social contract inside of Russia after the last mobilization that prompted the exodus of hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian fighting males outside of the country, that Putin would stick to offering hefty contracts to induce people to join voluntarily, and often that would come from people who are outside of the major urban centers and from predominantly ethnic minorities, frankly, where they live in regions that are economically depressed, for whom the bonuses and what have you look like a good option for them. It sort of goes to show how great life is inside of Russia, where the option of getting killed within 48 hours arriving on the front is a risk worth taking.
Wow. So that's unfortunate. And it's also, I think, just once again, crazy to hear that, Russians have been able to really just been shielded from this, and to hear that they thought the Kursk incursion was really the first time they've been faced with this war.
It's really how Putin has managed to keep the war going as long as he's had, with the number of casualties that he's taken. There is the one thing that Putin has done right in his 20 years of power is create an information command and control structure where competing ideas and sources of information were steadily driven out. And especially after February of 2022, when the invasion was launched, what remaining centers and individuals involved with independent journalism remained, they left in a hurry. And they are now sort of trying to keep professionally active inside of Europe, mainly. A lot of them are concentrated in and around Germany, but they're trying to continue their work. But penetrating that information bubble is difficult. President Putin has done a pretty credible job in keeping Russians suspicious of news and views coming from outside of Russia, even including Russian compatriots. They're branded traitors as soon as they leave for the West.
Well, yeah, he's made it difficult and deadly. So I guess this brings to the next question of, we then have also seen Russia making significant advances in the East. And so there's been some concerns that Ukraine launching this incursion has taken off the necessary Ukrainian fighters off the East, and it's going to give Russia much more room to take over that land. What are you hearing, and what are the experts saying surrounding this?
Sure. So while Russia is on the march, it is not a rapid march. They are taking kilometers at a time, but at a time means like over the course of weeks. They're slowly closing in on the strategic point called Brokhovka, which is near the city of Donetsk in the Donetsk Oblast. This is a territory that Russia has been waging a separatist war in since 2014, but they haven't gotten this close to the actual main city until recent days and weeks. That offensive is still underway, and what Russia has going for it basically is just a large supply of reserves that they could throw in, and a large supply of bombs that they can launch from a lot of times from inside of Russian territory. And it's just very difficult for the Ukrainians to hold off on that. The Russians are taking, some estimates have it as 1,500 casualties per day.
Wow.
And it's just something that Putin is ready to pay that price in order to take this piece of territory off of Ukraine's hands and advance his war further into Ukraine.
Well, I guess that leads me to my next question. What are the death estimate tolls and also the displaced?
Sure. So we have better information on Russian casualties, and many sources estimate those casualties to be about 500,000 wounded and killed. And as I said before, right now they are burning through about 1,500 troops a day in this intensive fighting. A lot of this fighting is not exactly super modern warfare. This is return to World War II, if not World War I tactics, where they're sent in sort of massed attacks. And when the Russian troops are cut down, the fire and control batteries have an idea of where that fire is coming from, and then are able to target that with drones and artillery strikes. So it's for every time that a large number of Russian troops are taken out by, say, a Ukrainian artillery strike, that artillery position is threatened by return fire, counter battery fire. This has been sort of how the war has been going over the summer. It has not led to rapid Russian advances, but it's been slow and steady. For Ukraine, the toll's got to be in the tens of thousands, sadly, for the troops. We don't have as good information on that. But beyond the loss of troops, some 6.5 million Ukrainians have been displaced during this war. Some to the west of Ukraine, but millions have gone outside of Ukraine. And this is one of the more long-term devastating impacts of the war. Kids are now entering their third year of school outside, away from the home. Those who are abroad are in foreign schools. Those who are at home are going to schools in hardened positions like subway, platforms and other bunkers, because no school, no hospital, no residential building is safe from Russian attack.
Yeah, that's awful. It's an unfortunate reality of a war like this. Just saw the news that Ukraine has launched its first domestic-made ballistic missile, and they're testing it out, which brings me to Ukraine and the U.S. and support by NATO.
Okay.
It's evident that Ukraine is trying to take a couple of steps away, right? And be like, you guys have given us lots of help. We need things from you, but you will not control what we do in these actions. Mm-hmm. Where is Ukraine on an arms basis? And how much U.S. support do they need in order to... I mean, it doesn't seem like this war is going to end anytime soon.
Well, okay, so let me talk about the Ukrainians for a minute. They are highly dependent on Western military supplies, but they also have their homegrown defense production capacity. Ukraine is a nation without a navy that has basically sunk the Russian Navy, and they've driven the Russian Navy away from their shores through the use of domestically developed sea drone drones called Neptunes. They've sunk the flagship, the Moskva, and they've damaged a lot of other capital ships and sunk some others, and they've damaged a lot of Russian port facilities in Crimea, and that they've attacked some ports closer to home near the Kerch Bridge. You might remember in 22 and 23, there's this grain embargo, right? That the Russians were implementing and keeping the Ukrainians away from shipping grain. And there was thoughts that would cause wider global food insecurity, and that perhaps President Putin could profit from the chaos that he was, sowing by keeping this Ukrainian food supply from hitting world markets where they were needed. But actually, what it turns out is the Russian naval ships were driven away And that was largely done through Ukrainian production. So that the ballistic missiles that you mentioned, and some other long range drones that the Ukrainians have been developing, it's all part of this internal production package that Ukrainians have been working on, and they're very inventive. They are learning in real time on what works and doesn't work in terms of countering Russian electronic warfare. They're being pretty successful at targeting anti-drone sort of electronic warfare platforms that the Russians have been using. They're pretty good at developing software to have their drones sort of navigate patches of electronic warfare. It's really a sort of a sight to behold, and should Ukraine ever one day join NATO as an alliance member, and this is a long time down the road, I think, NATO will definitely benefit from the capacity of this battle-hardened and ingenuity and just ingenious, nation of people who are just really talented at coming up with solutions on the fly. A lot of the weapons that they receive, they sort of have to modify on the ground to work properly in the theater in which they're used. One thing to keep in mind, we are sending them tons of military aid, yes, but what we're doing is we're buying new stuff, which we put into our supply and then send the old stuff into Ukraine. That is the sort of the feeder loop that's going on. So it's not like a ton of straight up cash going to Ukraine. It's a lot of supply, right? People, I heard recently on an interview, some questioner saying, isn't, Zelensky buying, sort of rivers, like a Riviera property or something with diverted funds? And no, he's not. And while Ukraine does and continues to have problems with corruption in using aid and in management of its economy, it's something that's really just vastly diminished in the context of the current crisis. And it's just not the overwhelming, factor in how Ukraine translates the supplies it gets from holding off a far larger and better armed and better equipped nation that's invading it. Right?
No, I mean, it's remarkable.
It's so
absolutely
some percentage.
remarkable.
Think about it. It's like 5 to 10% of an annual of 1 year's defense appropriation, and for that money, the Ukrainians have eliminated up to 500,000 troops as killed or casualties, thousands upon thousands of armored vehicles, maybe up to a dozen capital ships. Suffice to say, if you were to offer that deal to any Secretary of Defense of the United States from 1950 to present, they would jump at it. If you offered that deal to Henry Kissinger, right, or Zbig Brzezinski, they would jump at it. Oh, really? No, at twice the price, it's a bargain. So, and by the way, not one U.S. serviceman is at risk with this. It's the Ukrainians who are doing the fighting. It's the whole ethos of the Ukrainians, I think, was summed up by their president, like at the outset of the war, when the Western Alliance gave him the option. They offered him to be set up government in exile, sort of like the Poles did in World War II. Like they were kept safe in Britain for the duration of the war. And he said, "I don't need a ride. I need ammunition." Right. So, it's just one of several instances of the Ukrainians saying just some cold-blooded stuff. Yeah. They should have known better.
Right. Literally. So it feels like they're moving away, and they've been able to kind of produce their own arms and their own technology in a way that has worked for them. So it feels like they're moving away a little bit from U.S. and NATO reliance. Is that a correct?
I don't know about moving away as adding to the capacities that.
Got it.
It's still a mainstay. The Western support is very much a mainstay of Ukrainian military capacity to stay in the fight. Mm-hmm. A lot of the tanks and armored vehicles that went into Kursk are Western supplied and made armored vehicles. Apparently, the Bradley fighting vehicle is proving to be gangbusters on the battlefields of Ukraine. Which look, I'm an old guy. I remember 60 Minutes doing some expose on the Bradley, like it's the worst thing ever. But no, it's doing really well in terms of keeping its occupants, alive when taking fire, and in terms of being able to deliver fire on the battlefield. It's just working quite well. Russian tanks, on the other hand, you hit one of those things just right, and for some reason they keep their ammunition sort of in a ring around the turret inside it. And so these things pop like dandelion heads.
Yeah.
You see turrets flying in the air like, dozens of feet in the air when these things go off, and they just burn on the ground. It's just amazing. It's the videos out there on the web.
Yeah. I don't go looking for those unless you want to see them. All right. That's my disclaimer. Yeah. Don't take Joe's word for it. For your own mental sanity, unless you really want to. No need to search.
They don't show anything too graphic, and I will say that if you really want, search for Rob Lee on Twitter. He's got this Twitter feed that posts both Russian and Ukrainian battlefield footage showing various armored vehicles and trenches and buildings getting exploded especially by drones, which have these cameras attached to them.
Fascinating. Well, I guess this brings me to my next question, because you mentioned a lot in the Kursk incursion, a lot of Western-made tanks and ammunition being brought into the battlefield. And so this brings me to my next question regarding the Ukrainians using missiles hitting Russian targets, which has been an ongoing conversation. And it appears that the U.S. has become more and more lenient regarding allowing Ukraine to use U.S.-made ballistic missiles within Russia. And I think at the current moment, they're allowed to hit certain areas in self-defense, but I believe they're discussing kind of loosening that even more. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. What are they talking about? And is there concern?
I'll clarify one point, that we're not giving the Ukrainians ballistic missiles, which have like thousands upon thousands miles range. It's going up in the atmosphere and coming back down. But we have these long range, like 500 kilometer range, ATACMS missiles, the HIMARS, rocket fire. These have the reach to go deep into Russian territory. And by the way, the fact that the Ukrainians have them now was not something that you would have expected like in 22 or 23. There's always been a reluctance to supply the next level of advanced weaponry and weapon platforms to Ukraine, because there's a concern, and by the way, it's a responsible concern among Western leaders, especially the Biden administration, that you don't necessarily want to provoke Russia into thinking that their physical survivability is at stake. You don't want to provoke a nuclear response necessarily, and the Russians have, by the way, all along gone out of their way to threaten a nuclear response from their officials and especially on Russian television. Like you have these. We'll come back to the television bit in a while, but
hoping that's like my dog, which is all bark, no bite.
Well, that's exactly it, right? There's so many red lines that we've crossed that you would think that we would be a little bit more inclined to go past the next one that they've drawn, right? It's a process that's frustrated Ukrainians to no end, but at the end of the day, we get there with the weapons that they need, and eventually we'll get there with the permission structure and how they're used. I'm fully confident of that.
Where does it stand now?
How's it stand now?
Yeah.
So the Ukrainians are allowed to hit sort of like military targets just out inside the Russian border, right? So if there's like a troop column moving in a certain way, they can hit them, and they already have in the Kursk offensive. There was a Russian column coming to counter them, and the Ukrainians used HIMARS with these cluster munitions and took out an entire column of tanks and troops and what have you. I think hundreds of Russian troops died in that. It's gotten some play, but not a lot, and perhaps not enough. But it has been the case. What's going on today that's relatively new is that the Russians and Ukrainians they were starting to negotiate not hitting each other's energy infrastructure. But the Kursk initiative sort of derailed, I think, those negotiations. That's what we're seeing in press accounts. And so now we're seeing the Russians step up their attacks on civilian infrastructure, including energy production. And we're seeing the Ukrainians start to hit the oil refineries again, right?
Just in time for winter.
Just in time for winter. Believe me, winter is a huge tactic on the part of Putin in sort of his calculus as to what's going to work and not work. But he has miscalculated 2 winters in a row, thinking that either the Ukrainians are going to give up or that the West is going to give up on Ukraine because Western Europe was so dependent on Russian pipeline gas. But they took 2 winters, but now they are fully sort of self-reliant, and I think they're slated by 27 or 26. The Europeans are to fully replace all pipeline gas reliance with LNG and other sources.
Interesting.
Liquefied natural gas, a lot of which comes from the United States, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. So, like, it's another instance of where what Putin thought would happen, the exact opposite. Because going forward, Europe is not going to be buying Russian natural gas again, because the only thing more expensive than natural gas or an alternative natural gas is a natural gas that gets cut off at a moment's notice because of a political dispute, right? So it's no longer a secure, reliable source of energy in Europeans' estimation. So, the thing with oil, you could put it on a ship and you could sell it anywhere. You can't really do that with natural gas. You have to usually deliver by pipeline. And if you cut off your most profitable market from this supply, it's not like you could be able to build a pipeline. Russia's a big place. It's hard to build a pipeline anywhere else for that natural gas.
Right.
So,
I do want to go back to something you said, which is regarding that there was kind of some discussion going on between the Russian and the Ukrainian counterparts about trying to compromise in how they handle their warfare. And I remember seeing a couple weeks ago that there was a huge exchange of prisoners of war and children. Mm-hmm. Is there any hope for any type of compromise, or because obviously Russia's not going to just walk away empty-handed. They've made that very clear.
Right.
Is this type of communication continuing to happen? Is there any hope for this war ending?
So it is helpful when you see prisoner exchanges. Even the negotiations over not attacking each other's energy infrastructure. The fact that the negotiations fell apart, that's bad news. But the good news is they're taking place. Mm-hmm. So I'm really sort of heartened by the fact that there are Ukrainians and Russians talking to each other about what the guardrails are for this current conflict. Okay? That's the great news. Here's the top line bad news, though. This war is not going to end until one of 2 people decides to end it, right? And the decision rests entirely in the brain of President Putin and President Zelensky. Now, here's the Putin side of it. Putin, I think, understands that this conflict is really not going so great, right? He's not quite getting what he wants out of it. It's not like a quick success like annexing Crimea was, which boosted his favorability ratings inside of Russia like nothing he'd ever done before, right? He was never so popular as the weeks after he annexed Crimea. And he thought, wrongly, that taking the rest or deposing Zelensky and installing a pliant Ukrainian government would be harder, but not impossible, right? And that once it was done, everybody else would just have to suck it up and get used to it. Kind of like when, Russia annexed those 2 provinces in Georgia in 2008, and kind of like when he started that separatist war and annexed Crimea in 2014, and kind of like when he was bombing the hell out of Syria, helping Assad stay in power.
Sensing a theme.
The theme is Putin is not going to stop until he is stopped. And right now he's being stopped inside of Ukraine. Okay? But here's the thing that Putin realizes, that if he stops now and comes away with anything less than a significant victory in terms of land acquisition, the fate of Russian leaders who fail at war is generally not a bright and cheery one. And the best news is they can get forced in retirement. The worst news is something worse happens to them. Mm-hmm. So I think President Putin plans on conducting this war until he is forced to stop. and he'll be forced to stop by Russians and not by Ukrainians or Americans or Great Britain or anybody else. It's Russians who will stop him, and it's generally the people who are an arm's length of Putin who have the best option to stop him. That terrifies him, I think, and a lot of his sort of rash decision making is reflected in that.
Has there been any reports of increased dissent within Russia?
Well, so here's the problem with that idea, and that is who's going to take Putin's place? Who's going to run Russia after Putin? It's not going to be one of the Putin cronies, because the one thing Putin has going for him is he still has legitimate popularity within the Russian people, because he is still the guy who saved Russia, in their view, from the 1990s, where Russia had its greatest economic contraction ever. It was far greater than the scope of our own Great Depression, for example. They went from a world superpower to a basket case that was receiving world charity and assistance to stay alive in the early days of the 90s. They were counted as a sort of almost as a laughingstock at the time. The 90s were a really tough decade mentally for Russians. And Putin comes along, and he has the great wisdom to take power when oil prices are spiking, and he now has the resources to actually come through on making things better for ordinary Russians. Plus, he also is a better ruler by dint of not being a 3/4 dead alcoholic basket case, which is President Yeltsin. Okay, so he's actually fit, relatively young at the time, and not a drinker, and just Russians respect the hell out of him. Yeah. I don't know if I've told the story before to you, but I remember like in 2019 seeing these videos from Russian high schools where students are taping like disagreements taking place between students and high school teachers. And the students are like, who is this old guy, Putin? We're so tired of him. This old doddering fool. And the teachers, who are like my age, right, are yelling back at the students like, you ungrateful bastards, you don't know how good you have it. You don't know what it was like in the 1990s. You don't know what it was like to have to sell your worldly possessions next to a subway stop, or survive off the proceeds of your mother's dacha garden. It was a terrible time, and President Putin saved us from all of that. So we're following him, and you're lucky to have him. So that is still sort of the default switch in many Russian minds about what Putin represents. I kind of consider him to be the Russia Reagan, right? But and if he had left power in like 2008 or 2010 or 2012, he would be like one of the best Russian leaders in history. And now he's poised to leave Russia in an entire ruin of his own creation.
So what should we keep an eye out in the next couple of weeks?
So I think the next couple of weeks, it's a great question. It's who prepares, I think, for the coming winter the best. And I think Western allies need to show public commitment to Ukraine's defense and support. So not only are they able to sort of, especially air defense. So not only is Ukraine able to fend off aerial attacks from Russia, but also, are they going to be able to sort of somehow keep Ukrainian energy turned on for as much as possible, and just keep the government solvent and the population in the fight. The fact that Germany is making sort of hints and noises that they're going to curtail aid on the basis of financial reasons. They don't like to go into debt, for example. I think that's it's a concern. And every time one of the allies goes to use a Thatcher phrase, every time an alliance member goes wobbly, then Putin takes heart and thinks that he has something to stick around for. The outcome of the presidential election, I think President Putin has a sort of a lot riding on it, hoping that the anti-Russian forces, both in the administration and in Congress, suffer a loss. But so if the United States resolve for assisting Ukraine politically were to weaken, Russia would take that as a sign of Western weakness and would stiffen his spine all the more. The quicker Russia loses, the better it is for Russia, frankly speaking, in my opinion. And by Russia, I don't mean Putin. I mean the people who live inside of Russia. And obviously for the people of Ukraine. They face the hardest road imaginable back for recovery after the war is over. That is a struggle that is on the horizon for them.
Absolutely. Well, Joe, it's been great having you. Anything else you would like to add or say?
I will just leave you with a thought. If you and your listeners want to be entertained, I highly recommend going on YouTube, search in the little search box, Russia Media Monitor. And this is clips of Russian talk shows, political talk shows in prime time. So, and look, any crank with an internet connection in the United States could put out crazy, violent conspiracy theories.
I wouldn't say violent or conspiracy, but I am any crank with a media connection.
Look, I just Alex Jones, right? Anybody could be an Alex Jones. Okay,
absolutely. Hopefully not. In Russia, me. Hopefully people don't think that.
Present company very much excluded. In Russia, the cranks and the conspiracy theorists and the violent rhetoric, they are employed by the state. They are communicating basically Russian positions and viewpoints. When you hear these guys talk about how we need to eliminate Ukraine as a culture and society, that is the thought process of the Kremlin. It is also fun to watch it because as the war has dragged on, these guys are getting increasingly visibly upset, angry. It's something like you merge a bunch of grumpy old men with the insane clown posse. And this is sort of like the verbal spectacle that is Russian state TV talk shows, all subtitled for you by Russian Media Monitor. Couldn't recommend it enough.
Sounds like some great television choices. I'm very excited to do that after I get off of this. Well, Joe, It's been great having you. Thank you so much for coming back and breaking everything we need to know down for us about Ukraine and Russia and the war that's been going on.
Glad to do it and glad to see bureaucracy back in my podcast feed.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm your host, Emily Gross. We'll be back next week.